Hello everyone, welcome to the 63rd video of the Spiritual Brainstorm. In this video, I'd like to discuss concepts, that is words and all kinds of other things like names the way we've sort of segmented reality into things like atoms, cells, and so forth. Dualities, um, and exploring dualities through fear, unconditional love, and harmony. And then integration and a soul's journey of growth. So let's jump right into it. Before actually going to the content of the video, I forgot to mention in my previous video something that I wanted to tell you is that I was saying that we're going to invert our state of consciousness between awake state and a sleep state. And it's funny because when you're asleep, I'm not a specialist of this and you can Google it, but your wave patterns of your brain are much calmer. Whereas when you're awake in your normal state is just very crazy and active. And what's really funny is that, many scientists are saying that when you have dreams, actually a dream that, like, for instance, subjectively lasts like 1 hour and you've lived through plenty of different things, happens in like zero point 0.1 second right before you regain consciousness when you're about to wake up. So time is compressed infinitely in your imagination, in your dreams. And the asleep state is actually the right state in which to be in when you're in very high vibrational environments. Why? Because there's so much information. It's so complex, so complex that if you were to use your awake brain, which processes everything and all kinds of crazy thoughts coming on all the time, then you'd go absolutely nuts. It would be the same thing as basically taking someone from 10,000 years ago and dumping them in the middle of Times Square at night where you have all those flickering lights. They would go completely crazy because there's just too much information to process. And this very calm wave pattern is like a kind of filtering mechanism saying, only give me the info that is most relevant to me now, for instance, something very present moment, not like part of this looking into the future, part of this focused on the past, and very little actually in the analysis of the present moment, and constantly over processing, overthinking everything. And here it's really a very calm state, and nevertheless you can have these dreams and this complexity that condenses a lot of information in very little time. So that's parenthesis set aside, and we can go into the meat of this video. First thing I wanted to discuss is concepts. Lego blocks versus the manual. So when you purchase Legos, it usually comes with like a little manual for assembly where you have step 1, step 2, step 3. This is kind of the rule book. And then you receive the Lego pieces, the actual pieces. And this can be like atoms or molecules or cells, doesn't matter. Basically, we have segmented reality. We've created intermediary layers between us and reality in order to experience infinity in a certain way. So, as I've said before, imagine if you saw your body, as just living light, pure living light. There are no limits to this because you could just as well fly away or melt completely into a liquid state and stop being, or dissolve in a sea of light. I mean, there's just no limit if you just see everything as light, even though that may be the true nature of reality. Well, light. Actually, it's vibrations, but let's say light for simplicity's sake because it's much more intuitive for understanding. So if you view yourself as light, then there's no intermediary layers between you and pure vibrations. And there's also no limits as to what you can actually experience because anything can be built out of light. It's like in a movie. You can add anything. You can add anything via special effects. It's all just light, right? But by creating these intermediary layers, which is kind of like higher level languages in programming. So it's like you have between the zeros and ones on your computer, you have your BIOS, then you have your operating system, you have your program, and all of these are intermediary layers between you and zeros and ones, out of which anything can be built actually. But you cannot experience that. It's just impossible if you just randomly experience those. Wouldn't have any meaning. There would be no story. There'd be no experience. So you create these intermediary layers, but they could be anything. Now, what am I getting into? It's that there are two separate things. One thing is the concepts, like the atom, like the molecule, like the cell. Those are the building blocks, what I call the Lego blocks. And one other thing is the rule book. That is physics, chemistry, biology, and what rules apply to these. And these rules are very much like this assembly manual for Legos. It's nice to start with when you'd have no idea what you would build otherwise, and you don't know how to use these blocks. You first build whatever is in the rule book to get inspiration, to nourish your inspiration, and to sort of get familiar with how you can assemble them in a way that it fits in a coherent way, like build something coherent. But then once you're done building your Legos, then you want to experiment. You want to try building different things. Like you want to build a car instead of an airplane, or you want to build a house, or you want to build some kind of experimental thing. And that is exactly what we're doing actually in our dreams. I doubt that the people in the 10th century, for instance, the dreams of the people in the 10th century, were dreaming about cars, for instance. But we dream about cars, and we dream about cars in a way that completely bends the rules of physics, chemistry, and biology. We dream about flying cars. We dream about cars that, are, I don't know, they appear out of thin air. I mean, just plenty of different things. So we juggle with these Lego blocks very freely in our dreams, discarding all this, but we still use these as reference or as an inspiration for our imagination, which would otherwise be limitless, but which would yield a very chaotic kind of experience. If you just limit yourself to living light, no limits, then you're in for a bad dream, a bad sort of rude awakening, especially with our level of consciousness. And so that's the first thing I wanted to discuss is that any concept that we've created, like atoms, molecules, cells, or even things like good, evil, things like generous or selfish, things like colors, shapes, every single concept, every single word and concept that we have created, even for instance, God, Satan, any word, chakras, all of these are just ways to segment reality, to create little Lego blocks that you can juggle and build reality out of, instead of just being in this infinite, sort of, how should I say, it's like an infinite ocean of light, where none of this exists because it just meshed one into the other. And so you dissect reality into little bits and pieces that you label, like car, like tree, where if we weren't there to talk about those, then reality would just be a beautiful mosaic of color. No two trees are alike, no two cars are exactly alike. And so, from the point of view of an infinite being that is not in a relative reality, the concept of tree doesn't exist because it's just everything is just a beautiful mosaic of color with nice patterns, but with no concepts. So it's like they view it like a baby, basically, that sees plenty of flashy colors coming through it, and they cannot tell what is a plant, what is the floor, what is. I mean, those concepts don't exist in their minds, and so it's just sort of a beautiful um, scenery. Like if you went into a abstract art gallery, which was infinite, and you had all these paintings which were just mosaics of color, because if you don't build the word or concept for things, then everything is just a mosaic of color. What we think of abstract art is actually our entire reality. And so you use these concepts, but you ditch the manual, and that's how you sort of go from 3D to 5D, because 3D is the concepts plus the manual together, which limits you. 5D is the concepts without the manual, basically. That's how I understand it, at least. Because, of course, if you invert your state of consciousness, then in your mind, through your imagination, you can use the concepts, but you don't have to stick to the manual. Now, second thing I want to discuss is dualities. And many spiritual teachings are talking about unconditional love. I've already made a video about this. It's called Harmony, and I invite you to see it because I'm going to go through this briefly. But unconditional love only for yourself. Why? Unconditional love is the force that attracts. What is best, the best that you can do, is attract all the parts of you which you have rejected out of fear of yourself. For instance, if you view yourself as generous, then you've rejected the part of you that is selfish. You don't like that part. And so sometimes, and this is part of our learning experience here, is that some of these people that are, for instance, very generous, they experience reality and they constantly fall on, they meet those people that are selfish. And they're like, why am I the only generous person here? Why is everybody so selfish? Well, that is because you reject one side of the coin, which is inevitably, um, which inevitably exists. Like if dualities are just like trying to get rid of one side of the coin. If this side is being generous and that the other side is being selfish, if you try to just look at one side of the coin and just be generous and denying the fact that you're selfish, then your experience might be meeting selfish people. For you to be able to reintegrate part of yourself within you, put that coin in your pocket, and then consciously decide which one you want to express. And here is the one thing that most people don't understand, and this is very, very difficult sometimes to grasp. You can only be generous if you're selfish. Now let that sink in. If you reject your selfish part, and that's not even an option of being selfish, then you cannot be generous because then you're constantly in a giving mode and it's not even a choice. Therefore, generosity only exists in relation to selfishness. So it is your ability of being selfish which makes you generous, and it's your ability of being generous which can make you selfish as well. And until you integrate both sides of that coin, and you try to only express one and you reject the other, out of fear, for instance, which is the opposite energy, which divides and separates, then you will be sort of reminded of that side of you that you rejected. And so unconditional love is not unconditional love like walking in the street and, oh, I love this plant, I love this dog poop, I love this car, I love everything. It's loving every single facet of what makes you human, and you can detect which coin you're playing with by observing your reality, your daily experience, your life experience. For instance, one duality that I am sort of entangled in it right now is feminism, because I had a very bad sort of relationship with my sisters when I was younger, and I was a sort of a cruel brother, so I was incarnating the perpetrator, violent patriarchy, oppressive sort of whatever side. And so, of course, I feel guilt for that. And right now, I'm being exposed constantly to feminists that are sort of pressing on that button all the time. You're an oppressive patriarch, you're oppressive this and that and that. And until, because I've rejected that part of myself, I'm like ashamed, I don't like what I've done, I regret, I have all these harsh feelings towards myself. Until I forgive myself for having lived that experience of being a perpetrator for the purpose of growth, of my personal growth of my consciousness, then I will be stuck in this loop of constantly meeting, on the outside, part of myself that I cannot forgive or that I reject. And therefore, I will not be able to express, without remorse or without hitting a wall, my balanced side now, where I'm grown up and I'm not an oppressive male anymore, and I'm respectful and all of that. But I won't be able to express that in a positive way, because there's constantly that guilt that comes and follows me everywhere I go. And so it's only by forgiving yourself for having manifested experiences during your life to help the consciousness of humanity grow via the exploration of dualities and the integration of those dualities within you, that you can actually move on and resolve duality and integrate duality. There's no other way. So, integration of duality within you. And that goes for everything. But the thing is, what's nice here is that you don't make anything disappear. Duality disappears on the outside, seemingly, but it is integrated on the inside. And inside of you, you can actually merge opposites like generous versus selfish in a harmonious way. Because you see, the problem with unconditional love is, since it is a force that attracts, it would actually compress these two concepts together, and they would disappear altogether. Oops, disappear. It would cease to exist. So, if in duality, basically, it's like, imagine if you have two atoms that are positive and negative charge. Unconditional love would be fusing those two together and creating a neutral charge. I don't even know how you, like zero. It's a zero. And then there's no more experience of, well, pretty much anything, which is not the point. The point is to integrate opposites inside of you, just like the atom, where you have um, a structure where the positives and the negatives are in balance in such a way that they're not in opposition, but they don't disappear altogether. And that is possible. That is how you overcome duality at the human level, is by sort of reintegrating all sides of who you are, and then consciously decide which parts you want to express. And that, the how do you consciously decide? So that is I've already talked about this. That's really difficult because projecting yourself into the future and predicting all of your actions, how do you know which action is going to be correct or not? And so it's not about abandoning our rationality and our values, like, for instance, that of being generous towards homeless people, but it's about building on top of this with intuition and gut feeling, instinct. But an instinct which is of a higher level, not animal like. And so let's say that your values and your rationality say that it's nice to be generous with people. And you know this is right most of the time. But you leave space for intuition and gut feeling to guide you to say, maybe this is not the right time to be generous. So I think I've already told you this story, but one day in Paris, I was walking in the street. And on the first day, I gave €2 to a beggar that was there because I just felt like doing it. And the next day there was another beggar, and I just had 50 cents left in my wallet as change. And for some reason, I said, I don't feel like giving 50 cents today. And later that day, a colleague of mine asked for 50 cents from someone because he didn't have enough for buying a cup of coffee. And nobody had 50 cents except me. And that's when I realized, okay, that actually was right on. It was perfect. And you don't abandon your rationality and your values saying, well, now giving or not giving to a homeless person is absolutely equal and it carries equal weight, and being good or bad doesn't exist, and stabbing someone is actually just as good or probable or whatever as hugging someone. That's not how it works. You build on rationality and values, understanding that stabbing someone, there's only very, 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 very rare occasions where that may be appropriate. But you leave the appropriateness of doing it to your intuition or your gut feeling. You don't try to intellectualize and control it with your intellect. You use your values that you know that in like 99% of cases it's good to be like this or like that, and then you leave it to intuition and gut feeling to actually identify where those exceptions should apply. See? And so it's the same for duality. When you integrate the parts of you that you don't like, perhaps sometimes those parts should actually come up. If you, for instance, don't like the fact that you are um, um, that sometimes you're very angry and you yell at people. You don't like that. You like to be calm. Well, actually, there may be situations where being angry and yelling is the appropriate behavior, but how would you know, since you're not connected to infinity and you don't know the reverberations of your actions into infinity? You don't know what the consequences of you yelling here, like 2 years in the past, will have on a person 2 years later, or the significance of that action. So you don't necessarily know when to do it. But because through rationality, through values, through your life experience, you already have a sort of a feel for just how appropriate it is, in terms of, appropriate behavior in most cases, then your intuition and gut feeling is not going to be misguided. Like if you just said, well, yelling at someone or being calm is actually same 50-50. And that is the whole point of going from sort of being an animal and acting on pure instinct, survival instinct, to becoming a human and rationalizing things and sort of learning through experience, developing all these concepts to put things into words like emotions, like anger, like calmness, all these concepts, which then you use your intuition, your gut feeling, to transcend, or rather that you're not stuck in a kind of box, limited box that is rationality, where you just act like an automaton, where society said that calmness is good, therefore I am always calm, kind of like Let's give the example of the Japanese, like, and that's a people that have a culture that is extremely repressive in terms of their the expression of their emotions. And what happens is then these emotions express themselves through big explosions, like they would go on karaoke and go completely nuts, or they watch all those animes where emotions are actually overdone and all the characters are extremely emotional, going from being hyper happy to hyper sad to hyper angry, um, as a sort of a pressure valve. And here it's completely different. You're like saying, okay, I have this rationality which helps me, these concepts that are there, and I sort of abandon the user manual and, like I said before, and transition to a sort of a higher intuition or higher instinct, not the animal one, but the higher self, let's say, higher self instinct of when to use some of the sides that you would label as bad. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about is soul evolution and integration. What happens in my mind as sort of time advances, even though it's not really time, but so what happened before is you had the soul level here. This is, let's say, this is like the 10th century, let's say, like 1,000 years ago. You had the soul, and it incarnated into several different people of the time, for instance. And because those people could not handle integration of duality, one of them was poor, one of them was rich, one of them was generous, one of them was selfish, and they just lived about their lives and collected these experiences, and labeling them as good, bad, whatever. And then the transcendence of the duality happened on another plane, like I don't know what would be like the 7D or 9D. I don't even know. Who cares? Just a higher level. That is, the soul would be the part that would integrate those experiences and that duality. And now we're in the 21st century, and the soul is here. And now the soul actually is integrating even higher dualities, which is like planetary consciousnesses, like aliens and reptiles and whatnot, things that we would have a hard time reconciliating because we're just not ready yet. But at the human level, now within one incarnation, you can juggle with poor, rich. You can juggle with generous, selfish. You have evolved enough so that these integrations of dualities can happen in your 3D experience rather than at the soul level. So it's as if you were actually living 5 or 6 or 10 or 20 incarnations at once, because you may experience within the same lifetime being poor and being rich, being generous and being selfish, being tall, being small, being this or that, being angry and being calm. Where people before were much more one dimensional. Their lives were much more one dimensional. They were experiencing just one thing because they couldn't handle living multiple things. Of course, there are always exceptions to the rule, but that's basically it. And even when we're talking about, for instance, healing traumas and family traumas, that is what we're doing. Actually, we are kind of like the soul, that in 3D now, soul is here now, is, healing past traumas of family members, one being rich, one being poor, and trying to integrate that duality from our present moment. So, we actually we even may be the soul that is integrating those experiences at this present moment. Maybe that sounds crazy, but because everything happens at the same time, this is actually 3D, and this may be even like 2D. I don't know, like something even less high in vibrations. Let's just say this is like the fifth octave or something, and this is the third octave in terms of like vibrations in the piano or whatever. And it's difficult, of course, to talk about these things because they're just so multidimensional, and multidimensionality is very difficult to illustrate and talk about. But just understand that that's how basically the soul grows, is that instead of having to integrate things from these higher planes of existence, it manages to do the same, but in the same kind of material environment. It's a miracle if you think about it, that we're still kind of in 3D, which is the same overall dimension as people that lived in the 10th century. But now we can integrate multiple experiences and dualities in one person, where, the soul had to sort of split them into several incarnations just 1,000 years ago, just because people couldn't handle these contradictions and polarities. So I hope that's clear. One last thing I want to say is that, when you've kind of integrated all of these dualities within you, what happens? Do you think they disappear? Actually, they don't disappear, of course. But, instead of being stuck in a loop, it's like, if you're playing the piano, and then there's constantly this repetition of this one note that sticks out and that is played over and over again on top of other melodies. Da, 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 da. And then on top of that, you have like da, 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 da. And it's really nagging and annoying and frustrating and oppressive. And once you let go of those dualities and you integrate them, that note doesn't disappear, but it blends into a nice flowing melody where that note is just one note. It doesn't really stick out like a sore thumb, like somebody playing badly in an orchestra. It blends into one global kind of nice, music, that you cannot really like point to that one thing that is annoying. Think about it as like a painting where you would have all kinds of nice things drawn on it and everything, and then just one big red blob in the middle that was sticking out. And that's your non-integrated duality, where you would just see this one thing that's really sticks out and that is ugly, like for instance selfishness. And when you're done integrating this duality, that blob sort of shrinks and becomes invisible, and then you notice another blob because you're going on another duality. And then when you've integrated that, then it becomes much more this beautiful scenery that you can appreciate as the present moment, where since you're not stuck in any duality, in any rejection, and you love yourself unconditionally, you've integrated all parts of yourself, then when selfishness, for instance, appears, it disappears as soon as it appears. It's just an event that comes and goes, just like a note that appears in a melody, and then there's another note that's played right after it. You don't even notice it. So that's the whole point, and that's how every human will eventually, what will evolve into as we integrate dualities more and more. So I hope you found this video interesting, and talk to you next time.